Grace Ashford knew the weight of the white silk against her skin as if it were lead. Before the mirror in her bedroom at the family's modest country estate in Surrey, she observed a stranger in a wedding gown, her pale face framed by carefully arranged brown curls, her grey-green eyes devoid of the sparkle that usually characterized them. Her mother, Lady Margaret Ashford, adjusted the veil for the third time that morning, her trembling fingers betraying the nervousness that carefully measured words tried to conceal. "You are radiant, my dear," Lady Margaret murmured, though the tears held back in her eyes told a different story. "Mr. Morrison is a man of considerable fortune. You will never want for anything." Grace did not respond. How could she explain to her mother that she would rather starve than sell herself like cattle at market, that every pound sterling of Arthur Morrison's fortune would weigh on her conscience like a Judas coin? But the words remained trapped in her throat, for she knew all too well the despair that afflicted her family. Everything had begun to unravel 6 months earlier, when her father, Lord Edmund Ashford, had invested the entirety of the family's assets in a commercial venture in the colonies. The ships that were supposed to return, laden with spices and silks, never reached port. Lost in a storm, some said. Victims of piracy, others whispered. The truth mattered little in the face of the piles of dishonored promissory notes that now accumulated on the mahogany desk in the patriarch's study. Arthur Morrison had appeared as a providential salvation, a 50-year-old banker whose reputation in London's financial circles was impeccable, but whose personal life was shrouded in discreet rumours. A widower for a decade, the man maintained an austere existence, dedicated to figures and profits. When Lord Edmund had casually mentioned at a dinner in town that he had a daughter of marriageable age, Morrison had shown immediate and disconcerting interest. "Is she educated? Does she know how to manage a household properly?" were his first questions, as if he were evaluating a rural property for acquisition. The agreement had been sealed with the same coldness as a business transaction. Morrison would settle all of the Ashford family's debts and provide a generous allowance for Lord Edmund in exchange for Grace's hand in marriage. No word about affection, compatibility, or even mutual acquaintance. Grace had met her future husband only twice before that fateful day. Brief, formal encounters in which Morrison had examined her with calculating eyes, like a merchant appraising fabrics. The carriage that conveyed her to St. Mary's Church in Guildford swayed gently along the country roads. Grace kept her gaze fixed on the landscape beyond the window, the verdant fields of Surrey, the stone cottages with their flowered gardens, the peasants who paused their work to watch the bridal procession pass. Every detail etched itself into her memory as a silent farewell to freedom. Her father occupied the seat beside her, imposing in his formal attire, but Grace perceived the discomfort in his every movement. Lord Edmund had avoided meeting his daughter's eyes since he announced the engagement. Perhaps guilt weighed more heavily than he admitted, or perhaps it was merely disguised relief. Grace could not say. The church rose against the sky like a monument to inevitability. Built of grey stone in the previous century, St. Mary's had witnessed countless unions, some for love, many for convenience, all equally binding in the eyes of God and the law. Grace descended from the carriage with mechanical movements, allowing the maids to adjust her train, while her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The interior of the church was decorated with white lilies, their sweet perfume saturating the air. The pews accommodated a modest assembly, a few local aristocratic families, Morrison's business associates, distant relatives of the Ashfords, who had come more out of curiosity than genuine affection. Grace scanned the familiar and unfamiliar faces until her eyes landed on a discreet figure in the third pew to the left. Henry Whitmore remained standing like all the others present, but there was something in his posture that set him apart. A young lawyer of 26, newly established in Guildford, Henry had earned a reputation for unusual integrity in his profession. Grace knew him vaguely from sporadic social gatherings in the region, a man of medium height, dark brown hair, and eyes that seemed to see beyond social conventions. He had never spoken directly to her, always maintaining the respectful distance that etiquette demanded, but Grace had more than once caught his gaze resting on her during soirees and gatherings, a gaze that held something she could not entirely decipher. In that moment, as she walked down the aisle to the sound of the organ, it was Henry's gaze she sought. not that of the groom awaiting her before the altar. And in the silent meeting of their eyes, Grace saw something that strengthened her, compassion without pity, recognition without judgment. Arthur Morrison awaited her with an impassive expression, his hands clasped before him, his impeccable attire denoting wealth without ostentation. Beside him stood his personal solicitor, witness to the matrimonial transaction. There were no groomsmen, bridesmaids, or any pretense of genuine celebration. It was a contract being formalized, nothing more. Reverend Aldrich, an elderly man who had known Grace since her childhood, began the ceremony with a grave voice that echoed through the stone vaults. The familiar words took on an oppressive weight in that context. Holy matrimony, till death us do part, for richer, for poorer. What cruel irony that last phrase held, Grace thought, when wealth was precisely what united them, and poverty what forced her there. Morrison uttered his vows with mechanical efficiency, without emotion or inflection. There was no nervousness in his voice, no hint of joy or expectation, merely the fulfillment of a necessary formality. Then Reverend Aldrich turned to Grace, and the silence that settled seemed to suck all the air from the church. Grace Eleanor Ashford, do you take this man, Arthur Morrison, to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love and to cherish, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, till death us do part? Grace raised her eyes to the banker. She saw a man who could be her grandfather, whose motivations for that marriage were as obscure as they were pragmatic. Her eyes then swept across the church columns, rested briefly on her mother's distressed face, on her father's carefully neutral expression. Finally, as if guided by their own will, they turned to Henry Whitmore. The young solicitor watched her with contained intensity, and in that instant, something within Grace awakened. It was not love. How could it be when they barely knew each other? It was something more fundamental, the recognition that she deserved more than this, that her life was worth more than the price of settling others' debts. The words escaped before reason could censure them. I cannot marry for money. I would rather work for the rest of my life. The silence that followed was absolute, as if time itself had frozen. Grace felt the collective gaze of the assembly pierce her, heard her mother's stifled gasp, noticed Morrison's sudden stiffening, but she did not retract her words. Grace! Her father's voice boomed like thunder in the stillness of the church. Lord Edmund strode forward, his face purple with humiliation and fury. You don't know what you're saying. But Grace knew exactly. For the first time in months she saw with crystalline clarity. Morrison turned to her, his eyes narrowed in cold assessment. Do you understand the consequences of your refusal, miss? I understand better than you imagine, sir, Grace replied, surprising herself with the firmness of her own voice. And I beg your pardon for the dishonor, but I cannot proceed. Henry had remained motionless until that moment, but something in his expression shifted, a flicker of admiration perhaps, or of hope. Grace could not fully interpret it, but she felt for the first time that she was not entirely alone. The commotion that followed Grace's words would echo in that church for years in the whispered conversations of Surrey society. Lady Margaret let out a muffled moan, hiding her face in her gloved hands, while Lord Edmund advanced down the central aisle with furious strides, his shoes reverberating against the ancient stones like hammers of condemnation. You have ruined this family. Her father's words came out in a controlled hiss, though the tremor in his voice betrayed the magnitude of his fury. Utterly ruined it. Grace took a step back, but held her posture erect, refusing to bend before the storm she had unleashed. Her fingers tightened around the bouquet of lilies, hard enough to bruise the stems, but her voice remained firm as she replied, No, Father. I merely refuse to be the instrument of your salvation at the cost of my own life. Arthur Morrison observed the scene with an unaltered expression, as if he were watching a theatrical play of merely academic interest. Finally, he adjusted the cuffs of his frock coat with precise movements and turned to Reverend Aldrich. I shall consider this contract null and void, Reverend. Good day. His voice contained no anger, merely the same transactional coldness that characterized all his dealings. He walked down the side aisle of the church without looking back, his solicitor following him like a silent shadow. The assembly erupted in indignant murmurs. Some ladies abandoned their seats, conspicuously moving away as if Grace's disgrace were contagious. Others remained, immobilized by the morbid curiosity of witnessing the complete social destruction of a young woman who had dared to defy the most sacred conventions. Henry Whitmore moved then. While everyone else recoiled or watched paralyzed, he advanced down the aisle with determined steps, stopping at a respectful distance from Grace. His eyes met hers, and in that moment, she saw something that sustained her when her knees threatened to give way. Absolute respect. "Miss Ashford," he said, his voice low enough for only her and those nearest to hear. "You have shown extraordinary courage. Few possess the strength to choose truth over convenience." Lord Edmund turned to the young solicitor with a menacing expression. "Whitmore, this does not concern you. I suggest you withdraw while you still retain my benevolence." "With due respect, Lord Edmund," Henry replied without averting his gaze, "when we witness injustice, it becomes the responsibility of all men of conscience to take a stand." He made a brief but respectful bow in Grace's direction. "Should you require legal counsel in any capacity, my services are at your disposal." The offer hung in the tension-filled air. Grace understood the weight of those words. A newly established young solicitor offering assistance to one who had just become a social pariah. It was a gesture that could cost him clients, reputation, his very professional future. And yet, there he stood. "Your arrogance is remarkable, young man." Lord Edmund spat the words. "Perhaps when you have children of your own, you will understand the magnitude of what this fool has just done." "Perhaps," Henry agreed softly, "I will understand that some prices are too high to pay, even in the name of financial survival." Grace felt tears sting her eyes, not from despair but from overwhelming gratitude for that unexpected defense. Before she could formulate a reply, her mother appeared at her side, taking her arm with trembling fingers. "We must leave," Lady Margaret whispered, her voice strangled by shame and fear. "Immediately." The journey back to the Ashford estate proceeded in glacial silence. Grace occupied the carriage seat alone, while her parents had opted to travel in a separate vehicle. A deliberate exclusion that communicated more eloquently than words her status as a family exile. Through the window, she watched the landscape that had been so familiar become strange, as if her decision had altered the very nature of reality around her. When they arrived, Lord Edmund locked himself in his study, the sound of the door slamming reverberating through the house like a gunshot. Lady Margaret went to her chambers without uttering a word, leaving Grace in the entrance hall, still wearing the wedding gown that now seemed a white shroud. Martha, the maid who had served the Ashford family for over 20 years, approached cautiously. Her brown eyes shone with contained emotion as she murmured, "Miss Grace, let me help you change." In the sanctuary of her bedroom, Grace remained motionless while Martha unfastened the multitude of tiny mother-of-pearl buttons that ran down her back. Each released button seemed to alleviate a fraction of the weight she carried, until finally the dress slid from her shoulders like a serpent shedding its skin. "You were very brave, miss," Martha said softly, folding the dress with reverent care. "My grandmother used to say it sometimes takes more courage to say no than to say yes." Grace turned to the maid, her eyes glistening. "I have condemned my family, Martha. What kind of courage is that?" "The kind that allows you to sleep at night with a clear conscience," the older woman replied, her voice laden with conviction. "I saw him that, Mr. Morrison. His eyes, they were the eyes of one who sees people as property. You would have withered under that gaze." Perhaps Martha was right, but the truth offered little solace against the storm that was surely approaching. Grace donned a simple blue muslin dress and sat by the window, watching the sun descend over the fields. Somewhere beyond those lands, her reputation was being torn apart in the tea salons and drawing rooms of the rural aristocracy. By dawn, she would be known throughout society as the bride who had abandoned her engagement at the altar itself, a disgrace that no family could easily overcome. The summons came at nightfall, a sharp knock on her door followed by her father's rigid voice. "Grace, in the study, immediately." Lord Edmund's study had always intimidated Grace in her childhood, a masculine sanctuary of dark leather, polished mahogany, and the lingering scent of tobacco and brandy. Her father awaited her behind the massive desk, his hands clasped, his expression carved in granite. Lady Margaret occupied an armchair near the fireplace, her embroidery forgotten in her lap, her eyes red from recent weeping. "Sit," Lord Edmund commanded, indicating the chair before the desk, the same one where Grace had sat countless times as a child to receive reprimands for childish mischief. But this was no mischief. This was complete ruin. Grace obeyed, intertwining her hands in her lap to conceal her trembling. "Do you understand?" her father began, each word articulated with surgical precision, "that Morrison sent a messenger this afternoon. Not only has he withdrawn his offer of marriage, but he also demands immediate payment of certain debts he had agreed to absorb as part of the matrimonial agreement." Grace's blood ran cold. "How much time do we have?" 30 days, Lord Edmund replied, his voice hollow. 30 days to raise a sum that would take years to accumulate, or we lose everything. The estate, the lands, even the house in London. We will be not merely poor, Grace, but destitute." Lady Margaret sobbed softly, pressing a lace handkerchief against her lips. "Is there any alternative?" Grace forced the words past the constriction in her throat. "Another creditor, perhaps. Who would lend to a family whose daughter has so publicly demonstrated her lack of honor?" Her father leaned forward, his eyes like glowing embers. "You have not only ruined us financially, you have destroyed our reputation, our credibility. We are now pariahs, Grace, and the blame rests entirely on your shoulders." The words pierced her like blades, but Grace refused to bow beneath their weight. "I couldn't," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I couldn't sell myself that way." "Then prepare for the consequences of your foolish idealism," Lord Edmund retorted, leaning back in his chair with an exhausted expression. "In 30 days we will be on the streets. I hope your clear conscience offers comfort when we are begging for shelter." Grace rose on trembling legs, but before she could leave the study, her mother's voice stopped her. "Grace." Lady Margaret looked up, and in her gaze, Grace saw not just recrimination, but something more complex, perhaps reluctant understanding, perhaps even admiration hidden beneath layers of fear and social conditioning. "Your room will remain yours as long as we have a roof over our heads." It was a small comfort, but Grace clung to it like a castaway to floating wreckage. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Grace watched the shadows dance on the ceiling as her mind reeled. She had 30 days to find a solution, 30 days to prove she had chosen correctly, that there was more to life than merely surviving through unworthy sacrifices. And somewhere in the darkness beyond her window, she imagined Henry Whitmore in his modest office, perhaps pondering the extraordinary scene he had witnessed, perhaps questioning his own decision to become involved. Grace did not yet know, but that moment of courage at St. Mary's altar had set in motion a chain of events that would transform not only her destiny, but that of all whose lives touched hers. Dawn would soon break, bringing with it the first day of her new existence, an existence built on truth instead of convenience, on dignity instead of pragmatism. It remained only to be seen if such foundations would be strong enough to withstand the approaching storm. The 3 days that followed the disaster at the altar passed in almost absolute isolation. Grace remained confined to the Ashford estate, not by her parents' express command, but by the tacit understanding that her presence in public would only intensify the scandal. The curtains of her room remained partially drawn, filtering the autumnal light of Surrey into golden hues that danced on the faded carpet, cruel reminders of an outside world that continued to turn indifferent to her ruin. Martha brought her meals on tarnished silver trays, offering not just nourishment, but also fragments of information about the unfolding scandal. The venomous tongues of local society worked tirelessly. Lady Pemberton had publicly declared that she would never receive an Ashford in her residence. The Vicar of Godalming had mentioned the incident in his Sunday sermon, veiledly condemning the modern frivolity of youth that scorns sacred commitments. Even tradesmen who had served the family for generations began to demand immediate payment, fearing association with such a tarnished name. Grace absorbed each account like deserved lashings, though a stubborn part of her soul refused complete repentance. Through the window, she watched her father pace the gardens with heavy steps, his shoulders bowed under an invisible burden. Lord Edmund had aged a decade in those 3 days. The lines on his face deepened, His grey hair seemed sparser, and Grace felt the overwhelming weight of guilt mingle with her conviction that she had chosen correctly. On the morning of the fourth day, Martha brought more than the usual breakfast. Her eyes shone with contained excitement as she placed the tray on the small table by the window. "There's mail for you, missa," she announced, producing an envelope of considerable cream-colored paper. "Delivered personally by messenger this morning." Grace took the envelope with trembling hands. The red wax seal impressed with the initials H.W. in elegant cursive confirmed her suspicions even before she opened it. Henry Whitmore. Dear Miss Ashford, I trust this missive finds you in good health, despite the unfortunate circumstances. I beg your pardon for the presumption of writing to you directly, but certain urgent legal matters require your attention. During my legal practice, I have developed considerable knowledge of bankruptcy law and estate restructuring. I have taken the liberty of reviewing, through public records, the financial situation involving your family and Mr. Morrison. I believe there are legal avenues that could benefit Lord Edmund, should he be willing to consider them. Furthermore, through my professional connections in London, I have obtained information regarding a position that might interest you. The Viscountess of Hartwell, a lady of impeccable reputation and considerable influence, seeks a companion for her niece, Lady Caroline Hartwell, who will turn 18 next month. The position offers fair remuneration and lodging at the Hartwells' London residence. Naturally, I understand if you deem my interference impertinent. However, I felt compelled to offer assistance, however modest, to one whose courage at St. Mary's altar evinced a character of rare distinction. I remain at your disposal for further discussion of these matters, should you deem it appropriate. Respectfully, Henry Whitmore, Solicitor. Grace reread the letter 3 times, each word etching itself into her mind like an inscription on stone. The offer was extraordinary, not only in its generosity but in the delicacy with which it had been phrased. Henry did not treat her as an object of pity, but as a capable person worthy of opportunity. Her first reaction was overwhelming gratitude. Her second, paralyzing hesitation. To accept would mean abandoning her parents precisely when their situation was becoming desperate. But to remain, what benefit would it bring? She possessed no resources to save them, and her presence only amplified the family's shame. "Martha," Grace said, folding the letter carefully, "I need to speak with my father." The maid nodded vigorously. "He's in the study, miss. He's been spending days there, trying to find a solution for everything." Grace descended the stairs with measured steps, Henry's letter burning against her palm like a live coal. She hesitated before the study door, gathering courage before knocking lightly. "Enter." Lord Edmund's voice sounded exhausted. He looked up as she entered, and Grace saw momentary surprise cross his features before they hardened again into a mask of controlled disapproval. Piles of documents covered the desk, promissory notes, contracts, correspondence from creditors. The tangible evidence of their ruin. "I came to show you something," Grace said, extending Henry's letter. "It arrived this morning." Lord Edmund took the paper with evident reluctance, his eyes scanning the written lines. Grace observed the subtle changes in his expression. Initial skepticism, followed by clinging interest, finally something that might be cautious hope. "Whitmore," he murmured, placing the letter on the desk. "The young solicitor who dared to defend you in church. He offers legal assistance, Father, without obligation, it seems, and the position with the Hartwells. It would be a convenient escape for you," Lord Edmund completed, his voice laden with bitterness he could not entirely disguise. "To flee the consequences of your actions." The words stung, but Grace forced herself to reply calmly. "It would be a way to alleviate the financial burden on this house. One less mouth to feed, and my presence here only intensifies the scandal." Her father leaned back in his chair, running his hands over his face in a gesture of profound weariness. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its hostility. "The Viscountess of Hartwell is a woman of notable integrity. If she genuinely seeks a companion, the position would be respectable. Then I have your permission to reply to Mr. Whitmore." Lord Edmund gazed at her for a long moment, and Grace perceived something painful in his eyes, perhaps a belated recognition of the person she was, beyond the daughter whose obedience he had always presumed. "You do not require my permission, Grace. You made that abundantly clear when you refused Morrison before the altar." "But I would like to have it," Grace said softly, "despite everything." There was a prolonged silence. Through the study windows, Grace heard the distant birdsong, the whisper of the wind in the ancient oaks that flanked the estate. Sounds of normalcy that seemed to belong to a different universe than the one they now inhabited. "Write to young Whitmore," Lord Edmund finally said, turning his attention back to the documents on the desk. "Accept his offer of legal consultation. As for the position with the Hartwells, that must be your decision." He paused before adding, almost reluctantly, "He may be right about there being legal alternatives I had not considered. Pride has been my constant companion, but perhaps it is time to set it aside." Grace felt a lump form in her throat. It wasn't exactly reconciliation, but it was a beginning, a tacit acknowledgement that perhaps, just perhaps, her refusal of Morrison had not been entirely foolish. "Thank you, Father." He waved a hand, a silent dismissal, but as Grace reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Grace." She turned. Lord Edmund was looking out the window, his expression distant. "Your mother asked for you, perhaps. Perhaps you should visit her." It was an offer of peace, hesitant but genuine. Grace nodded, feeling tears sting her eyes as she left the study. She found Lady Margaret in her private drawing room, embroidering by the window that overlooked the rose gardens. Her mother looked up as she entered, and for a moment they merely observed one another across the space, heavy with unspoken words. "Come, sit with me," Lady Margaret finally said, indicating the nearby chair. Grace obeyed, and her mother resumed her embroidery, her hands working with mechanical precision. "Martha mentioned you received correspondence." Grace recounted the contents of Henry's letter, observing her mother's reaction. Lady Margaret remained silent until she finished, then laid her embroidery in her lap with a soft sigh. "The Hartwells are an exemplary family," she said. "Lady Caroline is known for her beauty and vivacity. She will require appropriate companionship for her first London season." She paused, her fingers smoothing the fabric of her embroidery. "It would be an honourable position, Grace. More than many in your situation could expect." "But it would mean leaving them," Grace said, guilt weighing in every word. "It would mean saving yourself," Lady Margaret corrected, finally meeting her daughter's eyes, "and perhaps indirectly helping us as well, if Mr. Whitmore can genuinely offer legal alternatives." Her voice faltered, fragile hope showing through the layers of aristocratic resignation. Grace took her mother's hand, surprising both of them with the gesture. "I am deeply sorry for the shame I have caused." "I know." Lady Margaret squeezed her hand gently. "And part of me understands why you did it, though another part still shudders to think of the consequences." Her eyes shone with contained emotion. "But you are my daughter, Grace, and despite everything, there is pride in my heart for your courage, even when that courage has brought us to ruin." These were words Grace had not imagined hearing, and they broke the dam that held back her tears. Mother and daughter remained there, hands entwined, sharing a silence that communicated more than speeches could express. When Grace returned to her bedroom, she sat at the small writing desk by the window and withdrew a sheet of letter paper from the drawer. The afternoon light filtered through the curtains as she dipped her quill in the inkwell and began to write. "Dear Mr. Whitmore." Her reply flowed with surprising clarity, words of gratitude and acceptance that sealed her fate. When she finished and applied the seal, Grace felt something akin to peace for the first time since that fateful day at the altar. A new life awaited her in London, and though the future remained uncertain, at least it would be a future built on her own choices, not on imposed sacrifices. The hired carriage conveying Grace through the streets of London swayed over the uneven cobblestones, each jolt reminding her of the growing distance between her former life and the uncertain future that awaited her. 5 days had passed since she dispatched her reply to Henry Whitmore, and the speed with which subsequent events unfolded left her simultaneously relieved and terrified. Henry had kept his word with remarkable efficiency. A reply had arrived within 48 hours, confirming the Viscountess of Hartwell's interest and requesting Grace's presence at the family's London residence in Belgrave Square. This was followed by direct correspondence from the Viscountess herself, an elegant letter on crested paper, welcoming yet formal, outlining the expected responsibilities and offering compensation that had made Lady Margaret raise her eyebrows in reluctant approval. The farewell from Surrey had been more painful than Grace anticipated. Her mother had embraced her for a long moment in the hall, whispering words of encouragement broken by stifled sobs. Her father had kept his distance, but in the final moment, he stepped forward and placed a brief kiss on her forehead, a paternal gesture he had not performed since her childhood, laden with emotional weight that rendered words unnecessary. "Write to us," he had said simply, and Grace had promised she would. Now, as London unfolded around her through the carriage windows, Grace felt like a traveller between worlds. The metropolis pulsed with a frenetic life that contrasted sharply with Surrey's pastoral tranquillity. Street vendors proclaimed their wares in voices that echoed between brick buildings. Elegant ladies walked the pavements under colourful parasols, accompanied by servants carrying parcels. Private carriages vied for space with delivery carts, creating a cacophony that simultaneously thrilled and intimidated her. Belgrave Square proved to be a district of impressive elegance. Limestone mansions rose in symmetrical rows around an enclosed central garden, their facades adorned with classical columns and wrought-iron balconies. The Hartwell residence distinguished itself with an impeccably maintained front garden and an entrance door flanked by polished bronze lanterns. An elderly butler of irreproachable bearing received her in the marble vestibule. "Miss Ashford, I presume. I am Pemberton. The Viscountess awaits you in the morning room." His eyes assessed her briefly, not with disdain, but with the precision of someone trained to quickly categorize people. Grace evidently passed some silent test, for he nodded slightly before leading her through a corridor decorated with ancestral portraits and furniture that breathed generations of refined wealth. The morning room was bathed in soft light, filtered through ivory silk curtains. The Viscountess of Hartwell occupied a chaise longue near the windows, embroidering with precise movements. She looked up when Grace was announced, and her face, matured with grace, revealed a welcoming smile that immediately eased some of Grace's anxiety. "Miss Ashford, what a pleasure to receive you." The Viscountess set aside her embroidery and rose, extending both hands in a surprisingly warm gesture. "Please sit. Pemberton, do provide tea." Grace settled into the indicated chair, conscious of every movement, every gesture being observed by eyes that, though kind, were undoubtedly discerning. The Viscountess must have been close to 50, but she carried herself with the elegance of one born and educated to occupy a position of influence. Her grey hair was impeccably arranged, and her dark blue silk gown communicated both wealth and good taste. "I trust your journey was without incident," the Viscountess began, personally pouring tea when Pemberton returned with the tray. "London can be quite overwhelming for one accustomed to the tranquility of the countryside." "It is certainly different from Surrey, my lady," Grace replied, accepting the delicate porcelain cup. "But a welcome difference." The Viscountess studied her for a moment, then nodded as if she had reached some conclusion. "Mr. Whitmore wrote to me regarding your circumstances, not in indiscreet detail, mind you, but enough for me to admire your courage." Grace felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "I fear others might characterize my actions in a less flattering manner." "Others often lack the foresight to distinguish courage from imprudence," the Viscountess retorted with gentle firmness. "I know Arthur Morrison, Miss Ashford. I have known him for decades. He is a man of considerable wealth and influence, but he is not a man I would wish to see any young woman united with in matrimony, regardless of financial circumstances." The words offered a validation Grace hadn't realized how much she needed. She felt a knot form in her throat, but forced herself to maintain her composure. "My niece Caroline," the Viscountess continued, "will turn 18 in 3 weeks. She is a lively, intelligent young woman, but she lacks the guidance that only someone close in age can offer. Her mother, my dear sister, passed away when Caroline was 12, and since then I have done my best to guide her. However, I recognize my limitations." She smiled with amiable self-deprecation. A woman of my age is hardly an ideal confidant for the dreams and worries of a young lady on the eve of her first social season. I understand perfectly, my lady, Grace said, and I am honored by the trust you place in me. The trust came by way of Mr. Whitmore's recommendation, the Viscountess admitted. He spoke most favorably of your character. It is rare to find a young solicitor with such integrity, and his recommendations are not to be taken lightly. Grace felt a different kind of warmth, not of shame, but of something more disquieting, upon hearing Henry mentioned. He had remained in her thoughts with disturbing frequency since that day at the church, though she attributed it simply to gratitude for his timely intervention. Caroline is currently visiting friends in Richmond, the Viscountess continued, but she will return tomorrow to make your acquaintance. In the meantime, I shall have Pemberton show you to your quarters and familiarize yourself with the house. Dinner will be served at 7, and I should be delighted if you would join me. We can discuss your responsibilities in more detail then. Grace was led through a majestic staircase to the second floor, where a suite of rooms had been prepared for her. The bedroom proved surprisingly spacious, decorated in shades of mint green and cream, with windows offering a view of the rear gardens. A canopy bed occupied a central position, flanked by carved wooden chests of drawers. There was even a small writing desk by the window, a luxury Grace had not expected. Lady Caroline's apartments are just there, Pemberton indicated, pointing to a door at the end of the corridor. The Viscountess requested that you be nearby to facilitate your responsibilities. Your trunks will arrive shortly. Should you require anything, simply ring the bell. When finally alone, Grace approached the window and observed the gardens below. Gardeners worked amidst perfectly manicured flower beds, and beyond the property walls, London stretched in all directions, a city of infinite possibilities and equally numerous perils. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. A young maid entered carrying a jug of fresh water. "I've come to help you freshen up before dinner, miss. I am Agnes, assigned to assist both yourself and Lady Caroline." Grace thanked her, allowing Agnes to help her change into a more appropriate gown for dinner. As the maid worked, she chatted animatedly about the house, providing valuable insights into routines and expectations. "The Viscountess is a very fair lady," Agnes explained, as she adjusted the sleeves of Grace's dress. "And Lady Caroline, well, she's a real ray of sunshine. You'll like her, I'm certain." Dinner took place in an intimate parlour, not the formal banquet hall Grace had glimpsed when being led through the house, but a smaller, cosier setting where the Viscountess apparently preferred to take her private meals. The food was excellent, served with silent precision by trained servants, and conversation flowed with surprising naturalness. The Viscountess proved to be a woman of varied interests and firm opinions, expressed with a tact that only decades of navigating treacherous social waters could teach. They discussed literature, music, and the political changes stirring the continent. Grace found herself gradually relaxing, her own education allowing her to contribute intelligently to the conversation. "Tomorrow," the Viscountess said as they took tea after the meal, "Mr. Whitmore will be calling to discuss certain legal matters concerning your father's finances. I have taken the liberty of inviting him to join us for dinner, hoping you will not object to his presence." Grace felt her pulse quicken involuntarily. "Naturally not, my lady. It would be impolite of me to object, considering all he has done." "He is a remarkable young man," the Viscountess observed, her eyes studying Grace with perhaps overly keen attention. "The son of a country vicar, he educated himself through sheer merit. There are few men of his generation with such a combination of intelligence and principles." Grace merely nodded, uncertain how to respond to what seemed to be veiled approval. Later, lying in her new bed in an unfamiliar room, Grace listened to the night sounds of London, so different from the pastoral silence she was accustomed to. Distant voices, horses' hooves on cobblestones, the constant hum of a city that never truly slept. She thought of her parents in Surrey, facing the consequences of her choice alone. She thought of Henry Whitmore and the unexpected kindness he had shown. And she thought of the future unfolding before her, uncertain, challenging, but undeniably hers. For the first time since that fateful day at the altar, Grace allowed herself to feel something beyond guilt or fear. She felt hope, fragile and tentative, but undeniably present. London offered her a chance for a new beginning. It remained only to discover who she would become in this new life she had chosen for herself. The pendulum clock in the vestibule chimed 6 o'clock as Grace descended the stairs the following morning, her fingers gliding lightly over the polished mahogany banister. The Hartwell residence was gradually awakening. Servants moved with silent efficiency through the corridors, preparing the house for the new day. The aroma of freshly baked bread wafted from the kitchens, mingling with the discreet scent of beeswax that kept the wooden floors gleaming. Agnes appeared in the side corridor, carrying a jug of fresh water. "Good morning, Miss Ashford. The Viscountess requested you join her in the conservatory for breakfast. Lady Caroline arrived during the night, earlier than we expected." The conservatory proved to be a sanctuary of glass and wrought iron at the rear of the residence, where exotic plants thrived, protected from the London weather. Morning light filtered through the glass panes in golden patterns that danced over the verdant foliage. The Viscountess occupied a wicker chair near a table set with delicate porcelain, but she was not alone. The young lady seated beside her turned as Grace entered, and the smile that lit up her face was like sunshine breaking through clouds. Lady Caroline Hartwell possessed that radiant beauty which depended not on perfection of features, but on an irrepressible vivacity that animated every expression. Blonde hair fell in waves over her shoulders, not yet arranged with the elaboration the afternoon would require, and her blue eyes sparkled with genuine curiosity. "You must be Miss Ashford." Caroline rose with an enthusiasm that made her aunt smile indulgently. "Aunt Victoria told me about your arrival. I came back from Richmond last night just to meet you. I simply couldn't wait until today." Grace performed a suitable curtsy, but Caroline had already advanced, taking her hands with surprising familiarity. "Oh, let's dispense with these tedious formalities when it's just us. May I call you Grace, and you must call me Caroline. We shall be friends, I'm absolutely certain." "Caroline, do temper your fervour," the Viscountess interjected with evident tenderness. "You're frightening poor Miss Ashford before she's even had breakfast." "Nonsense, Aunt, I'm merely being welcoming." Caroline led Grace to the table with cheerful determination. "Come, you must be famished. The cooks here make the most marvellous tarts." As they settled, Grace observed Caroline with growing interest. The young lady conversed animatedly about her stay in Richmond, describing horseback rides and musical soirees with vivid details that brought the occasions to life. There was a refreshing sincerity about her, no affectation or excessive concern with impressions. It was hard not to be captivated by her infectious enthusiasm. "My first season begins in 3 weeks," Caroline explained, serving herself generously from a fruit tart. "Balls, dinners, presentations at court. Aunt Victoria insists I must be prepared for everything, but frankly I find it all quite daunting." She paused, her eyes meeting Grace's, with a sudden vulnerability that contrasted with her earlier cheerfulness. "That's why I was so relieved when Aunt mentioned I would have company. Someone who could, well, understand." Grace felt an unexpected wave of sympathy. Despite their vastly different circumstances, she recognized something familiar in Caroline's gaze, the uncertainty of facing an unknown future, the weight of others' expectations. "I will do my best to be useful," she said softly, "though I must confess my own experience with London society is limited. But that's precisely what's perfect." Caroline leaned forward with renewed enthusiasm. "I don't need another governess telling me how I must behave, I need a friend." She turned to her aunt with a supplicating expression. "Isn't that the purpose, Aunt Victoria?" The Viscountess set down her cup with a smile that held both affection and amiable exasperation. "The purpose, dear child, is to ensure you navigate your first season with grace and propriety. If friendship blossoms in the process, so much the better." She directed a significant look at Grace. "But do not let Caroline's enthusiasm persuade you to neglect certain responsibilities. She has a tendency to over-enthuse." The following hours passed in an exploration of the residence under Caroline's animated guidance. The young lady led Grace through countless rooms, each more impressive than the last. The library occupied 2 entire floors, its arched shelves replete with leather-bound volumes. The music room housed a gilded harp and a dark wood pianoforte that Caroline played briefly, her fingers producing a graceful melody that echoed through the decorated walls. "This is where we'll receive callers during the season," Caroline explained as they traversed the main drawing room, a vast space dominated by crystal chandeliers and mirrors that multiplied the light. "Aunt says I must be prepared to receive at least 24 suitors." She rolled her eyes dramatically. "As if I were merchandise at an auction." Grace recognized the echo of her own feelings, though Caroline's circumstances were infinitely more privileged. "There will be considerable pressure," she agreed carefully, "but at least you will have a choice in the matter." Caroline stopped abruptly, turning to face her. Her expression revealed a surprising perception. "Mr. Whitmore mentioned something to Aunt, that you refused a marriage proposal. Is that why you came to London?" Grace hesitated, uncertain how much she should reveal. But there was something in Caroline's directness that inspired trust. "It was more complex than a simple refusal," she finally said. "But yes, my decision had consequences that made a change necessary." "You were courageous," Caroline declared with absolute conviction. "I would be so afraid of disappointing my family." Her voice softened. "My mother passed away when I was 12. Since then I've lived with this terrible need to honor her memory, not to fail in a way that would hurt her." Tears welled in her eyes before she blinked rapidly. "Forgive me. I get melancholic when I speak of her." Grace took her hand gently. "There is no need for apologies. The love we hold for those we've lost deserves to be expressed, not suppressed." Caroline squeezed her fingers gratefully, and in that moment, something genuine established itself between them, not merely the formal relationship between lady's companion and employer, but the beginning of a true friendship. The remainder of the morning passed in conversation that flowed with increasing naturalness. Caroline proved to be an avid reader, with surprisingly well-formed opinions on literature and politics. They discussed the works of Richardson and Fielding, debated the merits of constitutional monarchy versus absolutism, and laughed about the eccentricities of London fashion. When Pemberton appeared to announce that luncheon would be served shortly, Grace was surprised to realize how much time had passed. The Viscountess joined them in the private dining room, observing with evident approval the camaraderie already developing between the young women. "Mr. Whitmore will arrive at 4 o'clock, she informed them as they helped themselves to a delicate consommé. "Miss Ashford, he has requested a private audience to discuss developments concerning your family's finances. I have made the library available for that purpose." Grace felt a familiar quickening of her pulse upon hearing his name. "I am grateful for your kindness, my lady." Caroline observed her with renewed interest, a mischievous smile playing on her lips. "Mr. Whitmore is a remarkably handsome young solicitor, isn't he, Aunt?" "Caroline," the Viscountess admonished, though her own eyes sparkled with amusement. "Do temper your overly romantic imagination." "I am merely observing facts," Caroline protested innocently. "And it is a fact that he has shown particular interest in Miss Ashford's well-being." Grace felt a blush rise to her cheeks, much to Caroline's evident delight. Before she could formulate a reply, the Viscountess intervened diplomatically. "Mr. Whitmore is a dedicated professional who shows appropriate concern for all his clients. We should not read more into his kindness than it intends to convey." But the glance the Viscountess directed at Grace contained speculation that suggested she herself was not entirely convinced by her own words. The afternoon advanced with torturous slowness. Grace tried to concentrate while Caroline practiced at the pianoforte, but her thoughts persistently returned to the imminent meeting. Finally, at precisely 4 o'clock, Pemberton appeared in the music room where they remained. "Miss Ashford, Mr. Whitmore awaits in the library." Grace rose, smoothing her dress with hands that betrayed slight nervousness. Caroline offered her an encouraging smile, and the Viscountess nodded approvingly as she followed Pemberton through the corridors. The library was bathed in the golden afternoon light that filtered through tall windows. Henry Whitmore awaited near the bookshelves, examining a bound volume, but turned as she entered. He wore a formal black suit that accentuated his respectable stature, his brown hair carefully arranged. When his eyes met hers, Grace saw in them that same quality she had observed in the church, intelligence marked by genuine kindness. "Miss Ashford," he offered a respectful bow. "Thank you for receiving me." "The gratitude is mine, Mr. Whitmore," Grace replied, performing a suitable curtsy, "for the assistance you have offered both to me and to my family." Henry indicated chairs near the fireplace, where a leather portfolio rested on a low table. They settled with appropriate distance, but Grace noticed how his gaze lingered on her, not with impertinence, but with an attention that made her feel simultaneously exposed and protected. "I have news regarding your father's situation," he began, opening the portfolio to reveal carefully organized documents. "After a detailed review of the contracts and promissory notes, I have identified irregularities that can be legally challenged." Grace leaned forward, hope kindling in her chest. "What kind of irregularities?" Henry's eyes gleamed with professional satisfaction. "It appears Arthur Morrison deliberately structured certain clauses to maximize his advantage should the marriage not materialize. However, his own cunning may prove his undoing. Some of these clauses violate established principles of contractual equity." As he explained the technical details, Grace observed not only his words, but the passion with which he delivered them. Here was a man who found purpose in defending the vulnerable, who saw law not as an instrument of oppression, but as a tool for justice. The admiration she had felt in the church intensified into something deeper, more disquieting. Henry looked up from his documents, and his eyes met hers with an intensity that made the air between them seem charged. For a moment, they remained thus, words suspended between two hearts that were beginning to recognize something neither was prepared to name. Grace awoke before dawn, unable to shake off the whirlwind of thoughts that had assailed her during the night. Through her bedroom window, London remained shrouded in silver mist, the city's contours obscured by the morning haze. She dressed quickly, opting to forego Agnes's assistance, and silently descended the stairs towards the library, the only place where she might find the solitude her soul craved. The days since that transformative afternoon with Henry had passed at a dizzying pace. He had visited the Hartwell residence 3 additional times, always under the pretext of discussing Lord Edmund's legal affairs, but Grace had noticed how their glances lingered beyond what was necessary, how their conversations drifted from legal matters to more personal subjects. Literature they both admired, opinions on social reforms, memories of childhoods lived in completely different worlds. Caroline, with her perception sharpened by a naturally romantic temperament, observed these encounters with ill-concealed satisfaction. "You converse as if you were the only 2 people in the universe," she had commented after Henry's last visit, her blue eyes sparkling with conspiratorial glee. "It's absolutely charming." But Grace recognized the fundamental impossibility of the situation. Henry was a respectable solicitor, yet without significant fortune. She herself was the daughter of a ruined family, marked by the scandal of having refused marriage at the altar. Any union between them would be seen by society as an imprudence on both their parts, he sacrificing opportunities for advancement through an advantageous marriage, she accepting a position even more precarious than that of a lady's companion. The library was silent when Grace entered, only the tick-tock of the wall clock interrupting the quietude. She moved among the bookshelves, her fingers gliding over leather-bound spines, until muffled voices reached her ears from the adjacent study. The door was ajar, and Grace immediately recognized the Viscountess's grave voice. "Whitmore, I appreciate your dedication to Lord Edmund Ashford's legal affairs, but I fear your frequent visits to this residence may be misinterpreted." Henry's reply came after a brief pause, his voice controlled but laden with contained emotion. "My lady, I understand the social implications perfectly. However, I cannot deny that my concern for Miss Ashford's well-being transcends merely professional considerations." Grace froze, her heart accelerating painfully against her ribs. She should have moved away, preserved everyone's dignity by not listening to a conversation clearly not intended for her ears. But her feet refused to move her. "You are a young man of considerable promise," the Viscountess continued, her voice gentle yet firm. "You have established yourself well in London, earned a reputation for unusual integrity. An advantageous marriage could elevate your position considerably, open doors that would otherwise remain closed. With all due respect, my lady, I do not seek open doors through matrimonial convenience." The conviction in Henry's voice was palpable. I have seen enough of the consequences of such unions, the silent discontent, the resentment that corrodes even the most pragmatic arrangements. I prefer to build my future upon foundations of honest work and authentic choices." There was a prolonged silence before the Viscountess replied, and when she did, her voice held something that might have been reluctant admiration. "You speak with a rare conviction in a man of your generation, but conviction, however noble, does not feed mouths or pay bills. Miss Ashford has lived a life of relative privilege, despite her family's recent difficulties. Could you offer her the life she deserves?" "I cannot offer her luxury," Henry admitted, his voice dropping to a near whisper that Grace had to strain to hear. "But I can offer her respect, genuine partnership, and the freedom to truly be herself, gifts that no wealthy banker could guarantee, regardless of his fortune." Grace pressed a hand to her chest, where conflicting emotions waged a fierce battle, overwhelming gratitude for his defense, fear of the practical implications, and something deeper still, a realization that the feelings she had tried to suppress were not unilateral, but reciprocated with equal intensity. "You love her," the Viscountess observed, more a statement than a question. Henry's reply came without hesitation. "Yes, I loved her from the moment I saw her refuse Morrison at the altar of St. Mary's, when she chose truth over convenience. In that instant, I recognized a spirit that mirrored my own, one willing to sacrifice security for integrity." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. How could she have stumbled upon such a confession by accident? And yet she could not regret having heard it, for it confirmed what her heart had been persistently whispering, but which her reason refused to believe. "And Miss Ashford?" the Viscountess inquired softly. "Does she reciprocate your feelings?" "I do not know," Henry replied with painful honesty. "She has shown kindness and consideration during our encounters, but it may simply be gratitude for the assistance I offered her family. I would not presume more than that." Grace could bear it no longer. She retreated silently, her heart thundering, and withdrew to her room before anyone could discover her indiscretion. She sat on the edge of the bed, trembling hands clasped in her lap. As she processed everything she had heard, Henry loved her, not merely admired her or felt compassion, but genuinely loved her. And she, Grace forced herself to confront the truth she had been avoiding, reciprocated those feelings with an intensity that frightened her. But love, however authentic, did not resolve the practical realities that stood between them like insurmountable walls. Her father still faced impending financial ruin, despite Henry's legal efforts. She herself depended entirely on the Viscountess's generosity. How could they contemplate a union when neither of them possessed stability to offer? A knock at the door interrupted her reflections. "Grace?" Caroline's voice filtered through the wood. "May I come in?" Grace quickly wiped her eyes and smoothed her dress before replying. "Naturally." Caroline entered with an expression of concern she couldn't quite disguise. "Agnes mentioned you were down very early. Is everything all right?" Grace considered fabricating some convenient excuse, but something in Caroline's genuine concern stopped her. During the weeks she had spent in that house, she had developed a real affection for the young lady, not merely the appropriate sentiments of a lady's companion, but a true friendship. And friendship, Grace was beginning to understand, demanded honesty. "I saw Mr. Whitmore in your aunt's study this morning," she said carefully. "I overheard part of a conversation not meant for me." Caroline sat beside her, taking her hand with instinctive gentleness. "And what did you hear that distressed you so?" Grace hesitated, wrestling with the vulnerability that confession would require. Finally, the words tumbled out in a torrent. "He declared he had feelings for me." "Love," he said. "And I... Oh, Caroline, I do not know what to do, because I reciprocate those feelings, but I recognize the folly of allowing them to flourish." To Grace's surprise, Caroline smiled, not with amusement but with compassionate tenderness. "You believe love to be folly?" "When neither of us possesses the means to sustain it, yes," Grace replied, her voice breaking slightly. "He is an honest solicitor but without significant fortune. I am dependent on your aunt's charity." What future could we build on such foundations? Caroline squeezed her hand with surprising firmness. My mother used to say that true love finds a way, even when reason suggests impossibility. She and my father married against the objections of both families. He was a younger son with no significant inheritance. She possessed a modest dowry, but they built a life of genuine happiness, sustained not by gold, but by mutual devotion. "And what if it's not enough?" Grace whispered. "What if we condemn each other to an existence of constant struggle?" "And what if you don't try?" Caroline replied softly. "You would condemn each other to a life of perpetual regret, forever questioning what might have been." The words hung in the air between them, laden with a truth Grace could not easily refute. She thought of Arthur Morrison, of the life of material wealth but emotional poverty he represented. She thought of her refusal at the altar, of the conviction that had propelled her in that moment. Had she not chosen truth over convenience, and now she contemplated doing the exact opposite, rejecting authentic love for the sake of practical considerations. "You are braver than you imagine," Caroline said, as if reading her thoughts. "You proved it when you refused Morrison. Do not allow fear to prevent you from claiming the happiness you deserve." Before Grace could reply, Agnes appeared in the doorway, her expression revealing unusual urgency. "Miss Ashford, an express messenger has arrived from Surrey. He brings correspondence from Lady Margaret. Pemberton said it appears to be urgent." Grace's blood ran cold. She rose quickly, Caroline following her as they descended the stairs to the vestibule, where Pemberton waited with a sealed envelope that bore signs of hurried travel. Grace broke the seal with trembling fingers, her eyes quickly scanning her mother's familiar handwriting. Each line she read drained more color from her face until Caroline, alarmed, took her arm to steady her. "Grace, what has happened?" "My father," Grace whispered, the letter trembling in her hands. "He suffered a collapse 2 days ago. The physician says his heart is weak, aggravated by the stress of financial difficulties. My mother implores me to return immediately." The Viscountess appeared at the top of the staircase, having evidently overheard the commotion. She descended quickly, her expression grave but compassionate. "Naturally you must go, Miss Ashford. I shall arrange a carriage immediately." "But the legal matters," Grace protested weakly, her mind spinning vertiginously. "The work with Lady Caroline—" "It will be resolved," the Viscountess interrupted with gentle firmness. "Your family needs you now. That transcends any other obligation." Henry emerged from the library, evidently having heard the commotion. His eyes met Grace's across the vestibule, and in them she saw a concern so profound it almost undid her completely. "Miss Ashford," he said, advancing quickly, "allow me to accompany you to Surrey. I can be of use with any legal matters that might arise, and—" He hesitated, vulnerability shining through his professional composure. "I would like to ensure you arrive safely." Grace knew she should refuse, maintain an appropriate distance, protect them both from the complications that additional proximity would certainly bring. But as she looked at this man, who had declared his love for her, who offered support without expectation of return, she found she could not utter the words of rejection. "I would immensely appreciate your presence," she said softly, and saw relief flood his features. As she hurried to her room to gather essential belongings, Grace understood that she was returning to Surrey not merely as a worried daughter, but as a transformed woman. London had given her more than employment or refuge. It had given her clarity about who she was and what she valued. And perhaps, just perhaps, it had also given her the love she hadn't known she was seeking. The journey that awaited her would be challenging in every sense, but for the first time since that fateful day at the altar, Grace felt prepared to face it. Not alone, but accompanied by the man whose heart beat in unison with hers. The carriage traversed the Surrey roads as evening fell, its wheels raising clouds of golden dust that reflected the dying sunlight. Grace watched the familiar landscape through the window, each recognizable hill and stone cottage, evoking memories of a life that seemed to belong to someone else. Beside her, Henry maintained a respectful silence, though occasionally she felt the weight of his gaze, laden with a concern that required no words. The journey from London had transpired in an atmosphere of suspended tension. They conversed sporadically about practical matters: Lord Edmund's condition, as reported by Lady Margaret, the legal implications that might arise should the worst happen. But beneath these civilized exchanges pulsed an unacknowledged current, a mutual awareness that had grown since that morning when Grace had overheard Henry's confession to the Viscountess. When they finally sighted the Ashford estate, Grace felt a tightening in her chest. The house rose against the twilight sky with an air of melancholy it hadn't possessed in her memories. Perhaps it was merely a projection of her own fears, or perhaps the edifice itself mirrored the anguish of its occupants. The windows glowed faintly with candlelight, and smoke curled lazily from the chimney, signs of life that offered little solace. Martha awaited them at the entrance, her red eyes betraying recent tears. "Miss Grace," her voice broke as she embraced her with a familiarity that transcended protocol. "Thank heavens you're here. Your mother has almost lost her wits with worry." "How is he?" Grace could barely force the words past the constriction in her throat. "Stable for now, but fragile. Dr. Thornton was here this afternoon. He says the next few days will be decisive." Martha turned to Henry, vaguely recognizing him from the occasions he had visited the family. "Mr. Whitmore, Martha has prepared a guest room for you." Lady Margaret hurried down the stairs upon hearing voices in the vestibule. She seemed to have aged years in the weeks since Grace had departed, her hair greyer, her face etched with lines of anxiety that hadn't been there before. But when her eyes rested on Grace, tears of relief welled up, and she advanced with outstretched arms. "My dear girl." Lady Margaret held her with a strength that bordered on desperation. "I thought you wouldn't arrive in time. I am here now, Mother." Grace allowed herself to be sustained by that embrace, absorbing and offering comfort simultaneously. "May I see him?" Lady Margaret drew back, wiping her eyes with an already damp lace handkerchief. "He is sleeping, but he will awaken shortly. The doctor administered laudanum for the pain in his chest." Her eyes moved to Henry, recognition and gratitude mingling in her expression. "Mr. Whitmore, your presence is a considerable kindness. Edmund will be relieved to know you are here." Henry bowed respectfully. "Lady Margaret, I offer my services in any capacity they may be useful." The family gathered in the drawing room as night descended completely over Surrey. Martha served tea that no one truly drank, and Lady Margaret recounted the distressing details of Lord Edmund's collapse. It had happened in the study, where he had spent obsessive hours reviewing financial documents, searching for solutions that did not exist. The accumulated stress had finally taken its toll, and he had fallen unconscious over his desk, scattering papers that now remained where they had fallen, mute evidence of the battle he had waged until his body refused to continue. "He spoke of you," Lady Margaret said softly, her eyes meeting Grace's. "In moments of clarity between the pain, he repeated that he needed to see you, that there were things he needed to say." Grace felt a knot tighten in her throat. "I will go as soon as he awakens." Henry observed the interactions with a sensitivity Grace had begun to recognize as an essential characteristic of his nature. He did not intrude upon the family moments, but his presence offered a reassuring solidity, an anchor amidst the emotional storm that threatened to engulf them all. Close to 9 o'clock, Martha appeared at the drawing-room door. "Lady Margaret, Lord Edmund has awakened. He is asking for Miss Grace." Her parents' bedchamber had remained sacred territory during Grace's childhood, a place where she was rarely admitted except on special occasions or during times of illness. Now, as she followed her mother up the stairs, she felt the weight of all the years not lived in that space, all the conversations they had never had. Lord Edmund lay against white pillows that accentuated the sickly pallor of his skin. His eyes, once so authoritative and intimidating, now seemed sunken and vulnerable as they rested on Grace. He extended a trembling hand, and she advanced quickly, taking it between her own. "Grace." His voice emerged hoarse, each word requiring visible effort. "You came." "Naturally, Father. Where else would I be?" He closed his eyes briefly, tears escaping at the corners. When he opened them again, they held an emotional clarity Grace had never seen before. "I need you to forgive me." The words hung between them, laden with meaning accumulated through months of tension and recrimination. Grace felt her own tears threatening to spill. "Father, there is no need." "There is." He squeezed her hand with surprising strength. "I tried to sell you as property to save my pride. I placed debts and reputation above your well-being. your happiness, and when you displayed a courage I did not possess, I condemned you for it." His voice broke. "I am a foolish and selfish man, Grace, but I am also a father who loves his daughter, even when I have failed miserably to show it." Grace sobbed openly now, kneeling beside the bed to be closer. "I forgive you, Father, completely." Lord Edmund pulled her into an awkward embrace, hampered by his physical weakness, but powerful in its emotional sincerity. For long moments they remained thus, as Lady Margaret watched from the doorway, her own face bathed in tears. "Whitmore is here?" Lord Edmund asked when they finally separated. "Yes, he offered to accompany me on the journey." Something akin to a smile touched her father's pale lips. "He is a good man. I saw it even when my pride refused to admit it." He paused, gathering his strength. "There is something you need to know about the financial affairs. Whitmore succeeded, through his legal efforts. He managed to negotiate an agreement with Morrison. The debts will be restructured, the estate is safe." Grace looked at her mother, confusion and hope mingling. Lady Margaret nodded, tears of relief shining. "The letter arrived yesterday, but with your father so ill we had no opportunity to inform you. Mr. Whitmore was extraordinarily diligent." "But how?" Grace could barely process the information. Morrison would never agree. "Whitmore found irregularities in the contracts that rendered Morrison's position legally vulnerable," Lord Edmund explained, pride evident in his weak voice. Faced with the possibility of public scandal and prolonged litigation, Morrison agreed to more reasonable terms. "We still owe a considerable sum, but it is payable over years, not weeks." Grace felt a sudden dizziness, as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Henry had done this, not merely offered comfort or moral support, but actively saved her family from ruin. And he hadn't mentioned it during the entire journey, hadn't sought credit or gratitude. "He didn't tell me," she whispered. "He is the kind of man who acts from conviction, not for recognition," Lord Edmund observed. "The kind of man—" He hesitated, looking deeply into Grace's eyes. "Who deserves a woman of equal character." The meaning of his words was unmistakable. Grace felt a blush rise to her cheeks as she met her father's gaze. "He loves you," Lord Edmund said simply. "Any fool can see that. And I suspect you reciprocate those feelings, though you fear to admit it. Father, I have nothing to offer. No dowry, a tarnished reputation." "You have yourself," he interrupted, with a firmness that defied his physical weakness. "And that is a gift beyond any monetary value. Do not repeat my mistakes, Grace. Do not sacrifice genuine happiness for considerations of property or convenience." Lady Margaret approached, placing a gentle hand on Grace's shoulder. "Your father is correct. We have wasted too much time worrying about what society will think. Society will not watch over you when you are alone. It will not warm your heart during cold nights." Grace looked between her parents, truly seeing them for the first time as imperfect people navigating their own battles, not merely distant authorities. And in that moment, she understood that forgiveness was a two-way street. She needed to forgive them, but she also needed to forgive herself for all the choices she had feared to make. "I must speak with him," she said, rising with new determination. Lord Edmund smiled, his face softening with paternal tenderness. "Go, my dear girl, and when you return, bring him so that we may discuss your future appropriately." Grace found Henry in the garden, where he was observing the stars emerging in the night sky. He turned upon hearing her footsteps, and the expression on his face upon seeing her, concern, hope, barely contained love, almost undid her completely. "My father told me what you did," she said, drawing closer, until they were separated by merely an arm's length. "Why did you not tell me?" Henry briefly averted his gaze, discomfort evident. "It was not done for gratitude or recognition. It was done because it was right, because your family did not deserve to suffer for errors that were not their own. It was done out of love." Grace corrected softly, and saw his eyes return to hers, naked vulnerability shining through. "I overheard your conversation with the Viscountess. I did not intend to eavesdrop, but I heard you declare your feelings." Henry paled. "Grace, I never intended to place you in an uncomfortable position. If my presence here is improper—" Your presence here is the only thing that keeps my world in balance, she interrupted, closing the distance between them. And I need you to know that I reciprocate your feelings completely. I love you, Henry Whitmore. I love your integrity, your kindness, the way you see beyond social conventions to the essential truth of things. For a moment, Henry remained immobile, as if unable to process what he had heard. Then, with a movement that was simultaneously hesitant and resolute, he took her hands in his. I cannot offer you a life of luxury, he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, but I promise to work every day to ensure you never regret choosing me. I have already made my choice, Grace replied, smiling through her tears. At the altar of St. Mary, when I refused Morrison. I merely did not recognize then that I was choosing you, choosing the possibility of true love over false security. Henry gently pulled her into his arms, and Grace allowed herself to melt into that embrace, feeling finally at home in a way no physical edifice had ever provided. They remained thus beneath the starlit Surrey sky, two hearts that had found each other through improbable circumstances, united not by convenience or necessity, but by conscious choice and authentic love. When they finally returned to the house, they found her parents awaiting them in the drawing room. Lord Edmund, supported by Lady Margaret, smiled upon seeing Grace's and Henry's intertwined hands. "Welcome to the family, my boy," he said, his voice weak but sincere. "Take good care of my daughter." "With my very life," Henry promised, and Grace knew he would fulfill that promise with the same integrity that characterized every aspect of his nature. The following months would bring challenges: Lord Edmund's gradual recovery, the necessary financial adjustments, the planning of a modest but joyful wedding. But as Grace remained in the family drawing room, surrounded by those she loved, she felt a profound peace settle in her soul. She had chosen truth over convenience, courage over conformity, and in doing so, she had gained not only freedom, but a love that transcended all expectations. The future remained uncertain in many respects, but one certainty shone with crystalline clarity. She would face it alongside a man who valued her voice as much as her presence, who saw in her not property to be acquired, but a partner to be honored. Grace Eleanor Ashford had finally found her home, not within stone walls or elegant drawing rooms, but in the heart of someone who loved her exactly as she was.